In a bustling American town, 8-year-old Abigail Abby Wilson lived with her mother, Margaret, a retired schoolteacher. Though they had little, their modest home radiated warmth and love. Abby, with her radiant smile and golden curls, was adored by everyone in the neighborhood. Margaret, ever devoted, worked hard to ensure Abby had a childhood filled with joy, love, and the values that mattered most: kindness, compassion, and empathy. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind where the sky seemed to stretch endlessly in bright, clear blue, and the air was filled with the sound of laughter and distant traffic. Abby, her school day behind her, made her way home, her small backpack bouncing gently against her back. She took her usual route through the neighborhood park, a small oasis of green amidst the busy streets. She loved this walk, with the scent of fresh-cut grass and the sight of children playing. As she approached the park, Abby noticed something different. An elderly man was sitting on a bench near the playground. His clothes were tattered, his face lined with exhaustion, and his shoulders slumped as though he carried an invisible weight far too heavy for one person. His eyes stared vacantly at the ground, and there was a deep sadness about him that made Abby's heart ache. She had never seen him before, but it was clear that he was in need. Abby paused, her eyes locked on the man. She was only a child, but her heart was big, and it hurt to see someone so lost and alone. Slowly, she made up her mind. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her afternoon snack, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich her mother had made for her. It was her favorite, and she was hungry, but something inside her told her that the man needed it more. With a determined step, Abby approached the bench. The man didn't notice her at first, lost in his own thoughts. Abby stood there for a moment, then spoke softly, "Excuse me, sir?" The man looked up, startled. His eyes, a pale blue, met Abby's, and for a moment, there was only silence. Abby held out the sandwich, her small hand trembling just a bit. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, her voice gentle, almost a whisper. The man blinked, his gaze shifting from the sandwich to the little girl standing before him. He seemed overwhelmed, unsure of how to react. "Are you sure, young lady?" he asked, his voice hoarse and cracked, as though he hadn't used it much in recent days. Abby nodded, her curls bouncing. "Mom says sharing is caring," she said earnestly, her smile warm and sincere. The man hesitated for a moment longer, then, with a shaky hand, reached out and accepted the sandwich. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. A smile, small and tentative, spread across his face, the first smile he had worn in a long time. "What's your name?" he asked. "I'm Abby," she replied, sitting down beside him on the bench, her feet swinging above the ground. "What's yours?" "George," he answered, unwrapping the sandwich carefully, as if it were the most precious gift. He took a small bite, savoring the taste, and his eyes filled with tears he tried to blink away. "You know, Abby, you've made my day a whole lot brighter." They talked for a few minutes more, Abby asking questions in her innocent way. Where he came from, why he was there. George answered as best as he could, his voice soft, his words simple. He told her he used to be in the army, that life had taken some unexpected turns, and now he found himself here, trying to get by one day at a time. Abby listened intently, her eyes wide with empathy. She didn't fully understand what it meant to be homeless or how someone's life could change so drastically, but she knew enough to feel that George was a good person who had faced more hardship than anyone should. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Abby knew it was time to head home. She stood up, giving George one last smile. "I have to go now, but I hope you feel better. Maybe I'll see you again?" George nodded, his eyes glistening. "Maybe, little lady." "Thank you, Abby. You're a very special girl." Abby waved goodbye and turned, skipping down the path towards home, her heart light. She couldn't wait to tell her mother about her new friend. That evening, as the aroma of dinner filled their small kitchen, Abby excitedly told Margaret about George. She described the park, the bench, and the man with the sad eyes. Margaret listened, her eyes softening, her heart swelling with pride but also concern. She knelt beside Abby, brushing a golden curl from her daughter's face. "Abby, I am so proud of you," Margaret said, her voice gentle. You have such a kind heart. But remember, there are people out there who might not be as kind. I want you to always be careful, okay? If you see someone who needs help, come get me, and we can help together. Abby nodded, her eyes wide and serious. I promise, Mama, she said, wrapping her small arms around her mother in a hug. Margaret held her close, feeling both pride and a pang of worry. She wanted Abby to keep that innocent kindness, but she also wanted to protect her from the world. A world that wasn't always as gentle as her daughter. As Abby drifted off to sleep that night, she thought of George, alone on the bench. She hoped he was okay, that maybe tomorrow would be a little brighter for him. And in her heart, she knew that even a small act of kindness could make a big difference. The next day, as the morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, Abby and Margaret were preparing breakfast together. Margaret was at the stove, flipping pancakes, while Abby set the table with care. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the apartment, startling them both. Margaret paused, exchanging a quick, concerned glance with Abby. Who could it be this early in the day? Margaret walked cautiously to the door, Abby following close behind, her small hand instinctively clutching her mother's dress. When Margaret opened the door, 2 police officers stood on the doorstep, their expressions serious but not unfriendly. Abby's eyes widened, and she tightened her grip on her mother. Good morning, ma'am, one of the officers said, tipping his hat slightly. We're sorry to disturb you, but we're here about a man named George. Margaret's face registered a mix of confusion and concern, and she gestured for the officers to come in. Margaret led them into the small living room, and she and Abby sat on the couch while the officers took the armchairs. Abby looked up at the officers, her big eyes filled with curiosity and a little fear. George? The man from the park? Margaret asked, her voice tentative. The officer nodded. Yes, ma'am. George is a decorated veteran who has been missing for several months. Yesterday, he spoke to someone who recognized him and contacted us. He mentioned a little girl named Abby who gave him a sandwich. That act of kindness helped him open up, and we were able to identify him. Abby gasped, her eyes widening even more. Margaret put an arm around her daughter, pulling her close. Is he okay? Abby asked, her voice small but filled with concern. The second officer smiled kindly. He's safe now, sweetheart. He's at the VA hospital, getting the care he needs. We just wanted to stop by to thank you. What you did was very special. You helped us find George and reunite him with his family. Margaret's eyes glistened with tears as she hugged Abby tightly, her heart swelling with pride. You hear that, Abby? Your kindness made a real difference, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Abby looked up at her mother, a smile slowly spreading across her face. She hadn't realized that her small gesture could have such a big impact. She just wanted to help someone who looked like they needed it. Now, knowing that George was safe, a warmth filled her chest, and she felt a sense of happiness she couldn't quite put into words. Thank you for letting us know, Margaret said to the officers, her voice steadying as she blinked away her tears. We're just glad George is okay. The officers stood, nodding politely. It's not often we get to deliver good news, the first officer said. Your daughter has a big heart, ma'am. You should be very proud. Margaret smiled, her eyes on Abby. I am. More than words can say. After the officers left, Abby and Margaret sat quietly for a moment. Margaret looked at her daughter, her heart full. You see, Abby, she said softly, kindness can change the world, even if it's just one person at a time. Abby nodded, her eyes shining. She thought of George, alone on that bench, and hoped that now, he wouldn't feel so alone anymore. Margaret kissed the top of Abby's head, and they returned to their breakfast, the pancakes now slightly cooler, but somehow tasting sweeter than before. The warmth of that morning stayed with them, a reminder of the power of compassion and the difference even a little girl could make. News of Abby's kindness spread quickly through the town, becoming the subject of conversation at every corner. While many neighbors praised her, others were not as enthusiastic. They whispered that helping those people only encouraged trouble. At the grocery store, Margaret overheard a couple discussing her daughter, their voices dripping with disapproval. At school, Abby noticed some of her classmates giving her odd looks, their parents' sentiments trickling down to them. It all came to a head at a PTA meeting, where Margaret found herself under scrutiny. One woman, her voice sharp, stood up and said, "Margaret, I think it's wonderful that you're raising Abby to be kind, but don't you think encouraging her to associate with the wrong crowd could be dangerous?" Her words hung in the air, charged with judgment, and Margaret felt the eyes of every parent in the room on her. Margaret stood firm, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "Kindness knows no boundaries," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of those who dared to look her way. "If my daughter can bring hope to someone in need, that's an example worth following. I'd rather teach her to see the good in people than to fear them based on their circumstances." A few parents nodded in agreement, a soft murmur running through the room. Others remained silent, their expressions unreadable. Margaret knew she couldn't change everyone's mind, but she hoped her words had planted a seed, however small. The whispers soon reached the local news. A reporter showed up at their doorstep one afternoon, asking if they could interview Abby. Margaret hesitated at first, not wanting her daughter to face unwanted attention, but Abby seemed excited by the idea, her eyes lighting up at the thought of being on TV. The interview was short and sweet. Abby sat on their front porch, her golden curls catching the light of the setting sun, and spoke shyly into the microphone. "I just saw someone hungry and helped. That's what we should do, right?" she said, her innocence and sincerity shining through. The reporter smiled, clearly charmed, and the segment aired that night on the evening news. Watching it from their living room, Margaret felt a swell of pride. She looked at Abby, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her eyes glued to the TV. "You did good, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Not everyone in town agreed with what Abby had done, but that was okay. Margaret knew that the world needed more people like her daughter, people who saw someone in need and acted without hesitation or fear of judgment. And maybe, just maybe, Abby's small act of kindness would inspire others to do the same. Meanwhile, George was recovering in a veterans hospital, slowly regaining his strength. For the first time in years, he felt like he had hope. The doctors were kind, the nurses attentive, but what truly lifted his spirits was the unexpected reunion with his family. One evening, as he sat by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon, George was startled by the sight of a familiar face. His son, Peter. The last time they had seen each other, Peter had been a young man starting law school. Now, here he was, a grown man with the same determined eyes, tears glistening as he rushed forward to embrace his father. George couldn't believe it. He had thought he was lost to his family forever, but Peter had never stopped searching. Peter, now a successful lawyer, had spent years trying to find his father, never giving up hope that one day they'd be reunited. When he finally got the call that George had been found, he felt as though a missing piece of his heart had been restored. The reunion was emotional. Peter held his father tightly, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I thought I'd lost you, Dad." George, overwhelmed, could only manage a tearful, "I'm so sorry, son." But there was no blame in Peter's eyes, only love and relief that his father was alive and safe. They spent hours talking, catching up on lost time, and George learned how tirelessly Peter had worked to find him. It was then that Peter mentioned a little girl named Abby, whose kindness had set everything in motion. Peter knew he had to meet the girl who had given him his father back. A few days later, he visited Abby and Margaret at their home. Standing at their doorstep, Peter introduced himself, his voice warm and sincere. "Your daughter didn't just share a sandwich," he told Margaret, his eyes filled with gratitude. "She restored our family's hope and brought my father back." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at Abby, who stood shyly by her side, her golden curls catching the sunlight. Peter knelt down to Abby's level, smiling at her. "You have no idea how much what you did means to us," he said. Abby smiled back, a little unsure of what to say. Margaret placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, her heart full of pride. Inspired by Abby's selfless act, Peter decided to do something that would honor her kindness. He announced that he would fund a community initiative to help veterans and homeless individuals rebuild their lives. He wanted to ensure that others like his father had the support they needed to find their way back. And he knew just what to call it: Abby's Kindness Foundation. The foundation quickly became a beacon of hope in the town. It drew volunteers from all walks of life, each inspired by Abby's story and eager to be part of the change. Margaret and Abby worked tirelessly alongside Peter, organizing food drives, creating support programs, and spreading awareness about the struggles faced by veterans and the homeless. They wanted to make sure that people like George were never forgotten again. Even those in the neighborhood who had once whispered disapprovingly about Abby's actions began to come around. They saw the positive change that the foundation was bringing, the food drives that provided meals for those in need, the shelter programs that offered a safe place to sleep, and the community events that brought people together, united in a shared mission of compassion. The skeptics couldn't deny the impact that Abby's kindness had sparked. Margaret watched in awe as her daughter grew into her role within the foundation. Abby's innocence and genuine compassion were contagious, inspiring everyone she met. She spoke at community gatherings, sharing her story with a shy smile, and her words touched hearts. "I just wanted to help," she would say. "Everyone deserves a little kindness." The foundation flourished, and soon it was not just the town, but the entire region that felt the ripple effects of Abby's small act of generosity. Margaret knew that none of this would have been possible without Abby's open heart and Peter's dedication. Together, they had turned a moment of compassion into a movement that was changing countless lives. One evening, after a long day of planning a new outreach program, Margaret and Abby sat on their porch, watching the sun set. "You've done something amazing, Abby," Margaret said, her voice full of emotion. Abby leaned against her mother, her eyes on the horizon. "We all did, Mama," she replied softly. "It all started with just one sandwich." And as the sky turned a deep, comforting shade of blue, Margaret knew that her daughter's kindness had not only brought a family back together but had also given an entire community a new beginning. Months later, Abby's Kindness Foundation held its first major event, a community fundraiser and celebration that brought everyone together. The town square was decorated with colorful banners, tables lined with food, and a small stage set up at the front where speakers would address the crowd. People from all walks of life came to support the cause, filling the square with laughter and conversation. It was a day full of warmth and hope, a testament to what a simple act of kindness could grow into. George, now healthy and looking much more like the man he used to be, took the stage to share his story. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes scanning the sea of faces until they landed on Abby, who was standing with her mother near the front. George smiled, his voice strong as he began to speak. "This little girl reminded me that there's still goodness in the world," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Her kindness saved me, and now it's saving others." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd as George continued, recounting the difficult years he had faced and the light that Abby had brought into his life. He spoke of hope, of the power of compassion, and how one small gesture could ripple out and touch countless lives. Abby listened, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. She never imagined that her sandwich would lead to something so incredible. The event was a resounding success. It raised thousands of dollars to support veterans and homeless individuals, ensuring that more people like George would get the help they needed. But beyond the money, it was the sense of community that mattered most. Neighbors who had once been skeptical were now volunteering their time, their hearts softened by the transformation they had witnessed in their own town. People came together, united by a shared belief in the power of kindness. Abby, standing beside George, was the star of the evening. Reporters asked her how she felt about all that had happened, and she blushed, looking down at her shoes before answering. "I'm just happy to help people," she said simply, her voice clear and sincere. "It's what my mom taught me." Margaret watched from a few steps away, her heart brimming with pride. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the town square, she leaned down to Abby and whispered, "You've changed lives, sweetheart, including mine." Abby looked up at her mother, her eyes shining. "We all did, Mama," she replied, her voice full of conviction. As the evening drew to a close, the crowd began to disperse, but the feeling of unity lingered in the air. Margaret and Abby stood hand in hand, watching the last of the people leave, their hearts full. They knew this was just the beginning. Abby's Kindness Foundation was more than a project. It was a legacy, a testament to what love and compassion could accomplish. Margaret looked at her daughter, the little girl who had started it all with a simple sandwich. "This is just the beginning, Abby," she said softly. Abby nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her heart full of hope for the future. Together, they had built something beautiful, and they knew that as long as there was kindness, there would always be hope. As the story of Abby and George's journey spread, people across the country found themselves inspired. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, videos of Abby's Kindness Foundation's first major event were circulating online, touching countless hearts. The impact of Abby's small gesture had grown into something far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Her simple act of compassion had sparked a movement that was now sweeping the nation. Abby's Kindness Foundation became more than just a local initiative. It turned into a national symbol of hope and humanity. People from all over were reaching out, wanting to contribute, wanting to help. It seemed as though Abby's story had awakened something in the hearts of many, a reminder that, even in challenging times, there was still kindness and good to be found. Communities started their own initiatives, children began food drives at schools, and people were finding new ways to help veterans and the homeless in their towns. One small sandwich had indeed created ripples that were now waves of change. To our viewers today, we want to ask you, what would you do if you found yourself in a situation like Abby's? Have you ever witnessed an act of kindness that changed someone's life, or perhaps even your own? Maybe you were the one who decided to reach out when someone needed it most. These moments, these choices to care, are what make the world a better place. We'd love to hear your stories. Whether big or small, every act of kindness has the power to make a difference. Please share your experiences in the comments below, or feel free to email us directly. Your story could be the one that inspires someone else, just like Abby's has inspired so many people across the country. Thank you for joining us today on Life Story 999. If Abby's journey touched your heart, please remember to like, comment, and share this video with your friends and family. Let's keep this conversation going, and let's keep spreading kindness and hope wherever we can. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales of everyday heroes making a difference. Together, we can make the world a little brighter, one act of kindness at a time. Until next time, keep believing in the power of a simple gesture. You never know. It might just change the world.